Good afternoon, everyone. This is Scott Anthony, along with my friend Michael Putz. We're going to be going through today's discussion about the recently released MIT Sloan Management Review article, How Leaders Delude Themselves About Disruption. Webinar scheduled to go for about an hour. We only have about a dozen slides. Michael and I have designed this to be a very discussion-oriented webinar. So we will present a few things, but we'll have some back and forth questions between the two of us. And we'll try to get you engaged in the discussion as much as we can. We've got a poll question or two that we'll ask, and we'll pause at least once and maybe twice, depending on time, to get some questions from you. So thank you very much again for joining. Let me just provide some brief introductions about the people who are running today's webinar. So I'm Scott Anthony. I'm a senior partner at Insight. I've been part of the Insight family since 2003. Insight, for those of you who do not know us, we are a growth strategy consulting organization that helps leaders confront the challenges of disruptive change, exactly the sorts of things that Michael and I described in the article. Michael is somebody that I have known for almost 20 years now. He is somebody that we collaborated together about 20 years ago, and have continued to have conversations, and now are friends that got to write this article together. He's had a number of roles as a strategic business development person, as somebody who's worked on strategic alliances, with a big focus on helping large organizations grapple with disruptive change. He's helped to build businesses based on disruptive innovation, big billion-dollar businesses at large established companies. He's helped companies prosper in their core operations with disruptive change. And he is somebody who is a true expert on the disruptive literature, particularly the intersection between disruption and leadership. He will be your two co-facilitators as we go through today's discussion. Let me just tell you a little bit about the technology we will be using. This webinar is being recorded for those who weren't able to join, or those of you who want to share it with your colleagues. The link will be sent after the webinar is done. We have muted all of your lines. We're not planning on unmuting them at any point. Instead, we'll be using text-based questions. You can see some instructions about the specific buttons to click. So you see there's a Q&A button on top. If you want to submit a question, you can do it at any point during the discussion. You can see from the way my eyes turn, my laptop is over here, the camera's over here. So I will go here and look at the Q&A to see the questions that come in. When there are polls that are asked, make sure that you click the submit button, because if you don't, we can't look at your results. So with that as the technology, let's now get into the content. Now, let me tell you a little bit about the origin story of the article, and also spend a minute or two reflecting on the life and legacy of our recently departed dear friend, Clayton Christensen. So the article that we're discussing today traces back to a conversation that I had last summer with Karen Dillon, who co-wrote a number of books with Clay. She said that she had been asked by the Sloan Management Review to put together this special issue that just came out this week, Disruption 2020. And she said, is there anything interesting that's going on in the world of disruption? Which, of course, there's a lot of interesting things going on in the world of disruption. We'll talk more about that now. Of course, when Sloan Management Review was putting together the issue, they had no idea that its launch would come so close to the untimely passing of Clayton Christensen. I had the good fortune of being a colleague, somebody who worked closely with Clay, somebody who I viewed as a mentor, somebody who I viewed as a friend. And it's been a hard loss for our community. He passed away, as many of you know, in the middle of the month of January. I take three key lessons from my time working closely with Clay. The first is the power of ideas. Clay was a person who believed deeply that ideas matter. One of his core beliefs was that management, when practiced well, was the noblest of professions. And his mission and our mission has been to give managers powerful ideas and frameworks to help them do that well. The second thing I took away from him was to have purpose and meaning in life. I think many of you know the book that he wrote, How Will You Measure Your Life?, which is an indispensable guide to how you can think, not just as a business leader, but being a good person, father, spouse, etc. The third lesson was about boundaries. One of the reasons why Clay said people wouldn't live up to their purposes is they didn't set boundaries. They didn't fully hold to principles. They made those incremental decisions that took them off their intended course. The power of ideas, the importance of purpose, the enablement of boundaries, those are three lessons that I've learned from Clay, in addition, of course, to all the great theories and frameworks that he brought to the world. Michael, it'd be great to get your voice into the discussion too, and reflect a little bit about Clay's legacy and its impact on you.
Thank you, Scott. Yeah, so I had one of the greatest privileges in my career was to work with you and Clay almost 20 some years ago on research, a couple of research projects where we were trying to apply the disruptive innovation model to regulated industries like telecommunications and healthcare. And I was the power of Clay's ideas. I think they captured everybody in this webinar. They're so compelling and so powerful. Um, and the idea that we could bring disruptive innovation to other industries was exciting for those of us who are interested in disruptive innovation. But also the idea that if we had an economy, as Clay would talk about, an economy based on disruption, where that's the normal mode of operation, it would create an interesting situation where every business that's looking to achieve the holy grail of sustainable growth would have to master two different, paradoxically different disciplines: sustaining innovation and disruptive innovation. And once that Clay brought that insight to us, then the question was, well, how do you manage that? And he wrote this book called The Innovator Solution with Michael Rayner. In Innovator Solution, he talked about creating separate organizations to do sustaining and disruptive. But that created a challenge for senior leadership. They would have to toggle between the sustaining and disruptive, which are really paradoxically different modes of creating things, creating businesses. And it requires a huge mind shift switch, or what we might call a toggle between between a future back orientation and a present forward orientation. And doing that requires an ability to sort of be more reflective, more present, and more conscious. And we've seen a lot of leaders out there in the last 15, 20 years, last 10 years or so, talk about the importance of mindfulness in terms of being able to be more effective, but also to be a more effective leader in leading their organizations. And we'll talk about later in this webinar, there's many organizations that are talking about mindfulness programs, creating different kind of cultures that encourage the kind of innovation that you've been promoting with Insight. And the ability, with the passion I got around this work with Clay is that he opened up an avenue for not only growth, but an avenue for the growth of people and organizations that would then try to capture this disruptive innovation model. It could create transformations of leaders and organizations I think would be very beneficial. And that's part of feeding the purpose that Clay talked about. The purpose and meaning for me in this work was the benefit it would create for people and organizations. And so that's why I'm very passionate about this work, as well as helping to drive growth in organizations, which if we don't do that, we can't have the privilege to do all these other things like having purpose of meaning. But once it'd be fantastic to have the ability to bring together innovation, growth, and purpose and meaning in one package. And that's why I'm so passionate about this work.
Great. Thank you very much, Michael. And that leads a little bit to the next part of the origin story. So I told the first part, which is Karen Dillon called, this connection to Clay, which we've just talked about. The second part is then, why did Michael and I focus on this particular topic about the delusions that leaders tell themselves about disruption and how you overcome them? At least for me, this was a pretty easy call. When Karen said, what's new in the world of disruption? As you heard from Michael, I think we've all as a community done a pretty good job on the technical part of the answer, sustaining versus disruption versus disruptive, managing those two different types of innovation. My last book, Dual Transformation, with Clark Gilbert and Mark Johnson, we talked about transformation A and transformation B, a similar idea that different organizations do different things. So that's pretty well known. Yet the innovator's dilemma persists. So the question that was posed in the article is, why is this? And when that question began to form in my mind, Michael, you were the first person that I called, because I know this is something that you've really been wrestling with, this idea of why is it, while the technical answer is pretty well diagnosed and documented, people still struggle with it, which means it has got to be a leadership and cultural challenge. Say a little bit more about the path to the article from your perspective.
Yeah, so it began early on. Like I said, Michael Rayner, I had an opportunity to collaborate with you and Clay. Michael Rayner, who helped do the Innovator Solution, he was puzzled by the same question, because there was such compelling interest in Clay's work early on. He had access to CEOs, but we weren't seeing the level of traction because it seemed so compelling that this was the way to develop, disruptive innovation is the path towards continuous growth. And so the question is, why not? Why are people not doing it? And it became clear that this ability to toggle between mindsets is very difficult, because usually people have a school of experience where they learn sustaining innovation. There's a whole other school of experience. I live and work in Silicon Valley. There's usually a school of experience for disruptive innovation, and people usually live within those mindsets and are not comfortable toggling between those two mindsets. And that requires a level of inner development and inner transformation that goes all the way from mindfulness to really doing some deep inner work to be really skillful at making those shifts and moving between two radically different contexts. It's difficult for anyone to do. Imagine how difficult it is to do for someone who's responsible for leading large organizations. It's just, it takes a lot of inner work, and we really haven't developed those capacities and systematically in our leadership training. And it's something that's really critical to take on. So it's been something that we've identified long ago as being an opportunity. But as we'll talk through this webinar, these delusions of disruption, there's many different milestones on that path to getting towards what we would consider the holy grail of a truly present leadership team that can context switch easily and create sustainable disruptive innovation. So the question is, it's a journey. There's multiple steps along the way, and then we're going to talk about how we get there.
Fantastic. So let's now get into some of the actual content that we talk about in the article. So we start by talking about the basic problem. Again, the phenomena of disruption is a well understood phenomena. It has been detailed, torn apart, and so on. The first mass market article was 1995, hence the Sloan Management Review issue, 25-year anniversary of that article. Yet the problem persists. Data from Accenture shows almost 70% of companies are dealing with disruption. 44% are highly susceptible. Those numbers add up to more than 100%. So some are probably in both categories. Yet when we, Insight, goes to look at companies that are transforming themselves in the face of all this disruption, despite people saying that they understand it, despite people saying they're doing something about it, it's really hard to find examples that companies that are actually grappling successfully with some of the dilemmas of disruption. And Michael, we had a fun back and forth when we were drafting the article about who might be candidates for the next version of the innovator's dilemma if one is released 5 to 7 years from now. Companies that still look pretty healthy today, but might be getting caught in the snare of the innovator's dilemma. Who do you think might be on that list?
There's a fair number of companies, and we're always making predictions about the future, so they're highly uncertain. But there's companies like we see, like FedEx. We talked about FedEx because one of the things that we see in FedEx is that you see that FedEx is a classic disruptive innovator. And now we see the rise of people like Amazon who are integrating logistics into their business to help deliver their disruptive innovation of delivering on time, anything we want, when we want it, up to same day delivery. And so we basically see FedEx as a potential risk because we see changes in drone delivery and things of that nature, but also because Amazon is integrating parts of the logistic value chain into their operations and scaling that out. And it's a real threat to FedEx over time as Amazon takes on more and more of the delivery chain, both in the hub and spoke delivery and also as in the last mile.
Great. I think an interesting one to watch. And of course, when we think about these things, we're never saying that the leaders of these companies are stupid. Again, remember back to the innovator's dilemma, the subtitle was when new technologies cause great firms to fail. And that's part of the essence of Clay's research. It's doing the right things that help build your business turn out to be the wrong things when a disruptive change comes into your industry. And the example that I was thinking about in the same category is Netflix, which is an interesting thing just to think about because very clearly a massive disruptive success story. And one that has indeed transformed itself a couple of different ways over the past decade, as it went from DVDs through the mail to streaming video, as it went from being a place where you'd find other people's content to creating its own content, introducing the idea of binge watching and delivering everything at once. Amazing story. Yet, you look at what's going on in the industry now, you look at the behavior that people are following. I've got 4 kids and I watch what they do, engaging on platforms like YouTube with user-generated content, looking at platforms like TikTok, where people are having fun with really short-form videos. And you say, well, these aren't things where Netflix is particularly present. And of course, Netflix has not left the confines of its existing business. It still has stuck very closely to the idea of providing entertainment to as many people as it can. And that space, it is proven as attractive, has brought in other people. You've got now people like Time Warner and Disney and Amazon that all want to get a piece of the pie as well. I wouldn't bet against Reed Hastings and Netflix. They've shown an ability to successfully manage it, but you at least look at it and you kind of watch and wonder. And Michael, that goes back to something that I think you described really well on the last slide, but I want to see if you've got anything else to add to it. We're not talking about anything new. I mean, the innovator's dilemma, the fact that companies struggle with disruptive change is an old idea, yet it persists. And you talked about this challenge that leaders growing up in one world, for them to see the other side is hard. Absolutely. Any other things that you'd like to add about the kind of surprising persistence of these dilemmas of disruption?
Yeah, well, I would say that one of the biggest surprises for me is that with all these practical details laid out, that so few companies have taken on the journey of systematically implementing this. And I know that this is what you do every day with your firm, is the idea that this is not a one-shot effort. For example, we need to inject growth because there's a major market transition like digital transformation, right? So that's always on everyone's mind right now. Digital transformation is the current driver, brings people in, they say they need to do an innovation program. But the idea that this is going to be a continuous practice, a discipline that people would learn like total quality management or any other discipline they would have, it's really going to be a continuous process that needs to be installed at the board level, at the senior management level. It's a regular rhythm of the organization. They need to change their leadership development process. And that was, I think, that the thing that's most surprising 20 years later is that because all these elements have been laid out, the logical conclusion is we need to systematize this process, routinize it, and that hasn't been adopted more widely. And I think because of some of the reasons we'll talk about later, it's only now, I think, really being embraced.
Yes, and this then gets into the second part of the article. So the first part, we say, okay, disruption is still affecting the economy. There are great companies that might be caught again in the innovator's dilemma. Why does this persist? And the argument that we put forward in the second part is that there are a series of lies that leaders tell themselves, deceptions that they tell themselves, that make it hard to properly respond to disruptive change. Now, of course, the first one, Clay, is that the famous observation from Clay, the "in customers we trust." The root of what Clay found in the innovator's dilemma is listening to your best customers can be the worst answer when disruption comes, because your best customers won't tell you to invest in something that's lower performing, that's starting at the fringes, that doesn't appeal to them. So in customers we trust, sometimes. The second lie we then talk about it is the data tells us that we are safe. So the data tells us that everything looks good. And of course, the problem with data is it looks backwards and not forwards. So the data that tells you you're safe reports what happened in the past, not what will happen in the future. You look safe until you don't. Backward-looking data will tell you things are good until the cliff comes. The third thing we hear from people is that, oh, it's just too risky to do this, to invest in disruption, to do different things. That's not true. If you go to invest in innovation, what's the worst thing that happens? The absolute worst possible outcome is the thing flames out. You have the equivalent of Microsoft Zoom Player or Google Glasses or new code. Those are not good things, but they're also not things that cause the existence of a firm to be called into question. What gets companies in trouble is when they don't invest in innovation and they miss the big changes that take place in their market. If you don't invest in innovation, you know you have no upside, and the downside is limitless. If you do invest in innovation, the downside is capped and the upside has no limit. So the risk isn't innovating, the risk is not innovating. Then the fourth thing, our shareholders won't let us. We hear this all the time. Our shareholders, they're so focused on the short term. That's all that we need to do. We have to focus and deliver short-term results. If you actually go and look at the research, McKinsey's done some great research here, it's very clear. If you want to deliver short-term results, you have to think and orient towards the long term. It's a bit paradoxical, but if you try to deliver short-term results focusing on the short term, you actually destroy short-term results and therefore destroy shareholder value. So your shareholders actually want you, even though they might not have the right language for it, to have a longer-term orientation that embraces disruption. The fifth lie that we see repeatedly is our people just aren't up to the task. And because of it, our choice is either to do something really bracing, which is to do massive turnover, or just not to deal with it. But the reality is your people are capable of doing so much more. The example that we use in our article comes from one of the organizations we've worked with in Singapore, DBS, the largest bank in Southeast Asia that has undergone a stunning transformation. There was a moment along that transformation that really changed the way DBS thought about things. It was trying to go from being a regulated, stodgy bank to a more entrepreneurial company. It's going to study companies that you would normally study if you were trying to do that, like Netflix. So it's going to Netflix and it's grumbling a little bit. It says, oh, Netflix, you have it so easy. You're in Silicon Valley. You just hire young entrepreneurs and they give you the energy you need to do what you need to do. The person they were talking to said something that changed history for DBS. Said, well, actually, my average engineer isn't that young. They're 40 years old. How old are yours? Turns out they're about the same age. Then he says, you know, the truth is I actually hire a lot of people from banks. I just get out of their way. So DBS realized that the people were there. The people are there. They just needed to change the way they approached the things they were doing with that. So these are the lies that we go in detail in the article. And of course, the article goes through all of this in a bit more depth. But what I would love to do now is open up a little poll question. Let's see how well I do with the technology here. I think I have launched the poll. The question is, of those 5 lies and customers we trust, the data says we're safe. Response is too risky. Our shareholders won't let us. Our people can't do it. What do you see in your organization? Looks like we've got about 100 people on the webinar here. Let's see what you have to say. We've got responses that are coming in. Kristen, can you see this on your screen too? All right, my colleague Kristen is in the room with me. I'm just making sure you can see the same thing I can see. We've got it's always exciting when you can see the results in real time. You get to see human dynamics at play. Customers we trust isn't getting many votes, which means Clay did his job. People understand it from reading The Innovator's Dilemma. We're up to about half of you who voted. I'll let it go for just a couple more seconds. 53 people who have voted. That's fantastic. So it looks like we're seeing some good stability here. Interesting to see that we've got pretty wide distribution. So it's not a single thing that we're seeing. We've got a number of votes for everything. Response is too risky. It leads by just a little bit, but consistent with, I think, a lot of what we see in the field, because, you know, I would say we see all of these in the field at Insight, but the response is too risky, I think, is the one that we hear the most. And leaders will say, can we be sure? Can we be sure? Can you prove it? And of course, you never can prove it. You can prove the past, you cannot prove the future. And if you need something that's absolutely proven, you're just never going to do something different. So what you're seeing in the group that we have here is very similar to what we see out in the field as well. Michael, I'd be curious to get your perspective on this. You mentioned that the history in Silicon Valley, you worked at Cisco for a long period of time. Which of these deceptions spoke to you the most?
Well, what's fascinating in Silicon Valley is that sometimes we talk about our people can't do it. Well, it's oftentimes our people can't do it fast enough. And what's interesting is a lot of companies will say, hey, you mentioned the other comment, which is our shareholders won't let us. Well, a lot of times it's actually sort of a reverse logic here. Our people can't do it fast enough. And also we can rely on startups to do the innovation for us. And then we can buy at a premium the startups that end up being the winners. So it's actually safer for us to outsource the uncertainty of the early stages of a disruptive market. Let startups figure it out. Look at the winners. You know, I'm someone like Google, I can buy YouTube, right? And so that's going to be the best path forward for me. So the interesting thing is a lot of other industries outside of tech don't have the ability to pay large premiums to acquire winners at the early stages once we figure out who won the early stages of the disruptive war. And so what's interesting to me is that we see 20 years later that companies still pursue this path of buying one of the top 2 disruptive winners and paying a high premium for them and still being able to do that. And a lot of companies don't have that privilege. So that's the most surprising thing I've seen persist.
Fantastic. Well, you know, one thing we didn't get into too much in the article, but is certainly something that I've thought about a lot is what do you do kind of at a point level to combat some of these lies? And I think one thing that everyone should think about is how do you diversify your data sources, particularly for this idea that the data says that we are safe. If all you're looking at is numerical data, your financial figures, which are reporting decisions made in some cases years ago, it's very easy to fall into this trap. If your sense-making network also involves looking at peripheral developments, trying to understand what trends are taking place, looking at startups and so on, that can help a ton. the idea that innovation is risky, if it's only your own people who are thinking about this, you might see only the risks and not the upside. If you hear other voices in the discussion, they can help to combat this bias. I think some of the things behind these things are well-known psychological phenomena, confirmation bias, and so on, where if you get some diverse data sources, it can definitely help with it. All right, so what we're going to do now, we're going to stop sharing the poll results. So thank you all for voting. We're going to have another poll a little bit later, so make sure that you stick with us for that. We want to pause here and see what great questions you have to continue to advance this discussion. We've got more content coming after this. This is kind of the halfway point of the webinar. I do want to engage in a discussion with you and answer questions that are on your mind. Again, remember, for me to see your question, it's got to go into the Q&A button on the Zoom platform. I see there are a few questions in here. Now, don't worry, I'm not leaving. I'm just looking at my screen. The whole content of this webinar discussing an article. Yes, it is. That's the title of the webinar. It's the title of the article. So that is the primary focus of this. That's an easy one. So let's take one that has a little bit more meat around it. So the question here is, what about risks like the coronavirus, which I think is a very interesting thing, of course, for us to discuss at this particularly unique moment that we sit in world history. Michael, I wonder if I can invite you to offer an initial perspective on that, and then I will offer my thoughts as well.
No, please go.
You want me to go first? I was trying to save myself from it, but
yeah, no.
I will go first. Well, there's a couple interesting reflections as we are again in the middle of this moment right now. And of course, it's always dangerous to say anything when you're in the middle of or the beginning of, who knows, because you don't know how history will judge. But I think one thing that the current situation shows is that the world is only going to have more, not less uncertainty. So a black swan event or whatever you want to call it, there's going to be more things like this, not necessarily something that's a virus, but as leaders, we are going to increasingly going to increasingly have to deal with the fact that things like this are going to happen. The second thing that I think is you're going to see some trends that were taking place that might have been kind of fringe that are going to accelerate. The platform that we are on right now, using the Zoom platform, you're going to see a dramatic increase, of course, as people experiment with new ways of working that I think will have long-standing cascading effects about how people do work, how office real estate is constructed, how jobs are constructed. So I think this is something that is going to continue to have changes that go on even after the current crisis ends. And of course, in all of this, the idea that disruption continues to be important, that innovation continues to be important, I think is very crystal clear. If you look back through history, whenever there has been some kind of downturn, whatever it has been caused by, it has been a moment where companies that think in the right way, that go and act in the right way, can advance an innovation agenda quite substantially. It is a moment, given all the changes taking place, where people can go and create new disruptive growth businesses. Of course, there are a lot of challenges, there are a lot of things that we will need to work through, but there also, as always, are a lot of opportunities as well. All right, let me go to the question bank, Michael, and see we've got a bunch of other ones that have come in. So, oops, okay, here's a good one. This question is from Brian. Thank you, Brian, for the question. How can you sell your future, sell the future to your leaders when they're so bent on having concrete numbers to take any gamble? So again, Michael, I'll start with that one, but would love to see if you have any thoughts about this. So the way we think about this, and this is described very eloquently in a forthcoming book by my colleagues, Mark Johnson and Josh Suskowitz, the way we think about this is we always want to take a future back perspective. That is, we want to plant ourselves not in next year, but in 2025, 2030, or whatever, that year in the future. We want to imagine, what is that current environment going to look like? We can't know for certain, but we can, if we look at trends in the right way, we can paint a pretty good impressionist picture of that future. We then imagine what sort of organization we want to have in that future. What are our aspirations? What's our vision? What do we want to do to thrive in that future world? Almost always, without talking about any numbers at this stage, you will see a gap between the present reality and the future aspiration. And of course, there are ways to dimensionalize that with lots of data, but that idea of stepping out of the present into the future makes it much easier to have a safe conversation about it, because you're not arguing about, are we going to hit our forecast next week? You're talking about what really is our vision and what are we going to have to start doing today to begin to make it happen. Michael, other thoughts about how you sell this idea of doing something different to an organization that might be a bit recalcitrant? Michael, you're muted. You have to unmute.
Yeah, so Scott, I think the critical thing is you talk about how we have these black swan events, and sometimes that creates a herding effect where changes that have been, there's a famous old phrase that the future's already here, it's just not evenly distributed, right? And a black swan event sort of brings people to those changes that have been nascent, but people haven't adopted. And I think what we're really trying to do here with these models and books is that is to develop a proactive case for change, so we don't have to rely on black swan events to create transformation. That they show that such a compelling alternative, that it's well documented and systematized, that we can actually comprehensively develop and make this a safe option for companies to try on, so that they're prepared for these changes, so they can proactively look at it, so they don't have to depend upon an external impulse event which causes people to have to make a shift. So I really do feel very positive that we're moving in a direction where there's enough leaders and there's enough models and materials that people can proactively take these steps, as opposed to being forced into change by black swans.
Great. There's a couple questions here. There's great questions here, by the way. So I'm going to try and make sure we get as many of them as we can, but also want to balance trying to get some of the other content here. There's a couple questions that I will take as quick questions. So Simon asked the question, which incumbents are executing bold programs to fundamentally transform their business models today? If you go to the Insight website, we had a research report that came out last year titled The Transformation 20 that answered exactly this question. So I won't detail the research report, but there are lots of examples in it. I'd recommend just going and reading it. The thing that I think is interesting is their organization from lots of different places. So DBS that I mentioned before is there, but you also have software high-tech companies like Adobe and its big transformation, and you have energy companies like Ørsted in Denmark. So a really interesting set of companies all around the world doing really interesting things. And then there was a question from Tony about tracking leaders in nonprofits. I can't say in a systematic way, but certainly we will occasionally have a nonprofit that talks to us and says, here's some interesting things that we are doing. In the book Dual Transformation that I mentioned before, we have a case study on Settlement Music School in Philadelphia that I think its CEO, Helen Eden, has done some amazing things to transform that organization's business model. It's detailed in the book and also in an article we wrote a few years ago called Build an Innovation Engine in 90 Days. So if you want more details, you can go and look at those articles. Then the question, Michael, I wanted to pose to you, let's see if I can find this again. It was a great question about strategy functions. And the question was, do you have any advice, this is from an anonymous attendee, do you have any advice for a strategy team that invariably butts up against strong biases and opinions from a CEO that is very skeptical on what's possible? So what advice would you give if the CEO is skeptical and the strategy team sees that there might be something out there?
Well, I think that exactly what you've been doing in Dual Transformation, the work of Insight, the work Mark Johnson's coming out, is to show that there are so many different examples out there right now. And there's even big companies like what's going on with Microsoft with Satya Nadella. Microsoft was an incredibly successful company, but very well known to have a very challenging internal culture of internal competition. And you've seen Satya Nadella make a huge shift. And it wasn't, and the bottom line is that he's made a huge shift. He's really changed the culture. Microsoft's internal numbers in terms of employee satisfaction have gone up. Their economic results have gone up. Their shareholder returns have gone up. Satya Nadella has really shown the advantage from Microsoft financially, reputationally, and culture-wise of coming out there and really leading from an innovation perspective. And so I see, if you see a skeptical CEO, you can look at other leaders in the marketplace who are really have boldly stepped forward. And we're going to talk about some others who've really done this as well. You mentioned DBS, who've really boldly stepped forward and provided examples and case studies that are very visible that can be used to share with people, because sometimes people need confirmation from other leaders and from other success stories for them to bring that forward, because sometimes they're not going to believe you from an internal perspective. So you need to have that. There are external validators for this.
It's great. The one thing I would add to that, Michael, and then I think we're going to get back to the content. There's some other great questions here, some of which will be answered in what we go through, some of which we might catch in the next Q&A, assuming we track time appropriately, some of which we might answer afterwards. But the other thing that I would add is this is a story that's, again, in dual transformation. I won't tell you to just go by the book this time. I'll actually tell you the story. So Singtel is one of the case studies that's profiled in the book. This is the largest telecommunications company in Southeast Asia that has done a good job in transforming its core legacy telecommunications business to make it digitally driven and more data oriented, while building an interesting portfolio of new growth businesses. One very smart move that its CEO made early on in that journey was to essentially get the board and the top leadership team out of the markets in which Singtel operated and get them to innovation hotspots around the world. So she held offsites in Silicon Valley, offsites in Israel. They did something in China where they had no presence. And the point in each case was to expose the board and senior leadership teams to what tomorrow could look like. You heard Michael mention the William Gibson quote, "The future's already arrived, it's just not very evenly distributed." As Sakung, the CEO, told me, she said, I can have them read any number of reports, I can have them listen to any number of consultants, but once they go and see it with their own eyes, then they really begin to understand, and they understand what we're trying to do. So it's interesting, the question was a strategy person convincing a CEO. It was a CEO trying to get her board to be aligned behind what they were trying to do. So thanks everyone for the great questions here. Keep them coming. Again, if we manage time appropriately, we'll be able to get some more and also finish on time. But we've identified a problem, and of course now we want to get to the solution. So you've heard a lot about what we say the fundamental issue is. So we have said here the fundamental issue is that leaders have to increasingly be able to have this ability to, as Michael said, toggle. And there was one time we said it was toggle between sustaining and disruptive. I said dual transformation, transformation A, transformation B. You've heard a little bit about the lead from the future, Johnson and Suskowitz book, toggle between being present forward and being future back. And to really have this ability to toggle is not easy. This is not ambidexterity. This is not your left brain and your right brain and you just train both arms to do something. It's the ability to fundamentally step back, be able to understand this is a different circumstance, sit above something and really understand what's going on. If you look at the world of adult development theory, pioneered by Robert Keegan, among others, you'll know that that means that you have to have what's known as a self-transforming mind, where you're able, again, to step back, step out of, and have that ability to toggle between different frames. Now, this is a lot easier said than done. Research shows that somewhere between 1% to 5% of people have a self-transforming mind. So the fundamental argument that we make in the article is that the biggest lie that leaders tell is that they can transform their organizations without transforming themselves. Now, this is a very complicated topic that we didn't have space to fully answer, but we wanted to at least introduce one piece of what that could look like. And it went under the title of mindfulness. Michael mentioned it before, but a set of proven practices that allow people to be present, but also be able to step back and look at the world from different frames. And one of the case studies that we talk about in the paper, somebody who successfully drove a transformation and also has embraced mindfulness and related practices, both himself and in his organization, is Mark Bertolini. He was the CEO and chairman of Aetna. Those of you who follow the healthcare industry knows that Aetna merged with CVS Caremark in the United States a couple years ago to create a first of its kind combination that has the potential to radically disrupt healthcare. Mark is a very visionary leader that drove quite a big change in Aetna before the acquisition or the merger with CVS Caremark. And he also is somebody who has very publicly adopted things like mindfulness and has talked about the importance of it. You see the quote here, with so many things going on, whether in a small or huge organization like his, you can get frozen by just being overwhelmed trying to process it all instead of being present, listening, and focusing on what really matters. Now, Michael, I'm curious to get your take on this. You know, this sounds simple, being present and listening. Mindfulness has been around for a long time. Is this some kind of new age thing or is this a real thing? Now, of course, we wrote an article about it, so of course we agree with it, but we'd love to hear your perspective about why you think this is such an important thing.
Well, thanks, Scott. And it's really, you know, we mentioned in the article, there's been a revolution in mindfulness in the last 10 years. You see companies like we mentioned, SAP, who've instituted as a corporate program. You know, they have over 10,000 people participating in mindfulness programs, and they see it as a business critical function. So what's interesting about Mark Bertolini's journey is that he went through some personal transformations, as it happens for many people, found meditation as an important vehicle. It then led to a transformation in his own life that he wanted to share with the rest of the organization, and found that it had direct business benefits that we can measure. Like, you know, SAP's done surveys internally showing there's plenty of research out there in the last 10 years. You know, Google, other companies, not only Google actually has a meditation program they teach to other corporations, and they show very great benefits in terms of stress management, the ability to do context switching, which means, you know, I'm distracted or disrupted, I can keep task focus. I can bring my task focus back more quickly. You know, it's got very clear day-to-day benefits that are very measurable, health benefits, productivity benefits, overall employee well-being benefits. So it benefits everyone in an organization in all of their tasks, whether they're doing sustaining or disruptive in their everyday lives. But what's interesting is that when we're really trying to manage this idea of toggling back and forth, context switching between paradoxically different frameworks, meditation becomes a critical vehicle, especially for those senior leaders who have to do this back and forth. And so meditation and mindfulness is a enabling capability, but it's not the whole answer. And when you mention Bob Kegan and his work, I recommend to people, there's a Bob Kegan's done a lot of work. He's called on immunity to change. And I recommend, we don't have time to go over it, but immunity to change, helping people understand their inner cognitive biases. Meditation allows us to step back and be able to dispassionately look at our own thought processes, our own blind spots. It's a tool for getting distance from ourselves and perspective. Then Bob Kegan has tools like immunity to change, where he helps surface those assumptions we have that sort of limit our ability to be innovative, to be flexible, to switch context. And then furthermore, when people go through the journey of change, and transformation, Bob Kegan basically said adults usually go through multiple stages of evolving their self. And the journey that Mark Bertolini has been through as a CEO, oftentimes people come out not only through changing mindfulness allows them to have a better quality of life, more effectiveness and productivity, but also they find themselves changing, their perspectives changing. And Bob Kegan wrote a book called The Everyone Culture, which I recommend to people. And he talked about how organizations can become labs for adult development, where adults can develop the skills to have this perspective, to be able to shift mindsets fluidly with skill. And he talked about how organizations can be a living laboratory for developing those capabilities. And so mindfulness is critical. It's a very important foundational capability, but it should be part of a larger program of transformation. Bob Kegan, in his book, Everyone Culture, gives an example of how he recommends that be done. But there's other ways of doing it. But it's important is that mindfulness is part of a disciplined, comprehensive program of transformation, which includes executive coaching and other forms of development. And if we institutionalize that for senior leaders and and hopefully cascading through an organization in their leadership development pipeline, we'll end up having more conscious, more present leaders who are actually more effective, like Mark Bertolini, develop greater results. And as that change ripples through our culture, like we see leaders like Satya Nadella, we're going to end up we're going to have benchmark leaders who can then provide a model for other companies who can see that they can have the benefit from this, and it'll create change for organizations, both in the bottom line as well as in terms of the employee culture.
Great. Well, you have talked about some of the organizations that are doing this systematically. You mentioned SAP, you mentioned Google. We'll talk on the next slide a little bit more about the importance of doing this systematically. I want to reflect on one point, and then I want to ask one question to you, Michael. So the reflection, about a year ago now, I started an executive master's program. It's taught at the INSEAD campus in Singapore. It's an executive program, so it's 8 weekends over 18 months, followed by a thesis. And the title is Executive Master in Change. And it's all about taking a psychodynamic lens to individual and institutional change, using a lot of the things that Michael talked about here, a lot of Kegan work, et cetera. And the thing that has just been really interesting to me is if you take the strategy and innovation literature and you take the human and psychodynamic literature and you bring them together, you start to see some really interesting things. You get deeper insight about why this dilemma has persisted and what the toolkit needs to be to answer it. Does it make it easy? Of course not. We'll talk about the difficulties in just a second, but I think there are answers out there. But as always, the intersections are where you can find the interesting insights. So Michael, the question I wanted to ask you, you said at the beginning, we talked about the surprising persistence of the innovator's dilemma, how it can be, disruption can be a tool for growth and flourishing and all that. We are seeing some people leading the way, not enough. But at the end, are you an optimist or a pessimist about our ability to overcome these challenges?
I'm an optimist. You know, I really, I don't want to, I'm just picking people who are visible. We could talk about other people, but, you know, we look at Mark Bertolini, we look at a Satya Nadella, and I see that there's a number of leaders who are stepping up and realizing that, you know, being the human development part of leadership is a critical part of their being a more successful, innovative, and more productive company. Also, the next generation of leaders, Gen X, millennials, have a very different value set, very much more focused on, you know, human and personal growth. And I think these next generation of leaders expect a more humane and work environment as they become the leaders, as they become the bosses of these organizations, they take over the senior positions. I have a tremendous amount of optimism that they're going to bring these practices in as a new normal for them. It won't be a few breakthrough leaders who bring this through. There'll be people who expect this to be the way the world of work should work, who have been entrepreneurs, built their own companies, have thought of themselves as they're going to be they have grown up thinking they're going to have a life of continuous change and continuous growth, and have high expectations for the work environment, because the fluid boundary between work and life, there is no boundary between them. We don't leave it a 9 to 5 anymore. So if I am going to be a continually growing person, I expect the workplace to be a place where it supports my growth. And it's not going to be in a kind of like airy-fairy or new age or soft way. This is very much, we're talking about business relevant growth. The idea that if we're more conscious of ourselves and our biases, we can understand our hidden assumptions, we're going to be much better at leading teams, giving feedback, understanding why we might reject some ideas because of our hidden biases. We're going to be more effective in our lives, as well as more happy. And so there's no boundary between, I think, the next generation's expectations and what we can develop in an organization where personal development and leadership development and effectiveness at work merge together.
Great, I think very well put. I share your optimism as an individual, just because I think we have now zeroed in on kind of the last piece of the problem to solving the innovator's dilemma. I think we've got the technical part of it very well documented and detailed. That doesn't make it easy though. So we make the assertion on this slide that for a leader to transform his or her organization, they have to transform themselves, and they have to develop this as a deep capacity. You mentioned a deliberately developmental organization that has the capacity to develop leaders who have the ability to do this. We talk in the last part of the paper, or last part of our article, we talk about these 4 great leaders, unquestionably great leaders. You can question some of their practices for each of them, but people who had massive impact on their businesses. A.G. Lafley at Procter & Gamble, Steve Jobs at Apple, Lou Gerstner at IBM, Jack Welch at GE. They had huge impact. They transformed their organizations. And in each case, what came after just wasn't nearly as transformational as what came before. So Lafley leaves, and then he gets called back a few years later. Tim Cook has done some fantastic things at Apple, but the magic just isn't the same. Lou Gerstner goes to Palmisano goes to Remedy. The cloud isn't really nailed by IBM. Watson hasn't realized its full potential. The need to transform is still there. And of course, we know what has happened with Jack Welch. So this is, and his successor, Jeff Immelt. This is really hard. We talked about a couple organizations that have driven this deeply. In the article, we also talk about Johnson & Johnson, thinking about managing energy and driving wellness through its organization. But Michael, I wonder if you could say a little bit more, this idea that we can be deliberate and developmental throughout our organizations. That sounds so nice. It sounds like a great thing to do. what makes it really hard? And despite our optimism, what are some of the challenges we still have to overcome?
Well, it's sort of like it brings everything together, Scott. For example, when we look at these amazing leaders, we came out of a generation of heroic leadership. We think of the singular leader, a Lou Gerstner who turns things around, right? Steve Jobs who runs Apple. I think that model, we've seen the incredible benefits of that model. We also see the great peril, because also we don't have the next great man or woman to lead after one of these successors. And it doesn't work that way. We need to actually, one of the challenges was each of these leaders you showed here, they didn't develop the person who could replicate what they did. And they didn't take on the task of doing that. And so I think one of the biggest challenges is, first of all, a mindset that we hire heroic leaders, that they do it, right? And it doesn't work that way. It needs to be more of a distributed process of shared leadership and also developing leaders, first of all. So I think that mindset generationally is going to change. The second part of it is everything we've said before, is the work of being able to, these one-shot leaders oftentimes are what we call unconsciously competent. They were amazing at what they did, but they didn't consciously have a way of sharing with others. Whether you talked about Lafley, or Lafley probably would have shared that. Steve Jobs had no interest in sharing with other people his genius, because he thought it wasn't replicable. But the idea of being consciously competent about the sources of competence they have, and being able to share that systematically with other people. If you don't have a deep level of inner reflection and awareness, you can't then share those skills with other people, right? And so one of the biggest, I think, barriers to a deliberately developmental organization is a conscious or unconscious assumption that we have heroic leaders. We're looking for those special people. And this really is a capability that we have in everyone. We're not going to have we're not all going to be Lafleys or Steve Jobs or Jack Welch's. But I think everyone has the capacity to do enormous amounts of things. I think that's the promise in Clay's work he's talked about, is that we all can be innovative. I think we all can be tremendous leaders. I think we all have the capacity for growth and development. And as I said, a generational perspective, I think people think that's no longer reserved for special people. And the challenge for those leaders is then to become consciously competent of what makes them the unique people they are, and understand their biases, but also understand their talents and be able to consciously understand that and replicate it and share that with their teams. And before, that wasn't a requirement for people. So I think some of the barriers were people didn't know. There was no expectation of sharing this leadership. And people didn't have the tools for introspection to say, what was it that made me successful? Like Clay showed us a model for why disruption worked. It's not magic. He understood what disruptors before Christensen ever wrote a book. That's what I have a great hope about. Clay wrote this book on disruptive innovators, but people have been doing it for a long time before, but they weren't consciously competent about it. When Clay made it consciously competent, he allowed all of us to do what some of the great leaders did before. And I think we're trying to do the same thing. Expose what some of these great leaders are doing, make it more of a skill that can be transferable.
Fantastic. Well, speaking of conscious, I am conscious of time. We have just a few minutes left. So what I want to do now is I want to do a quick summary of what we talked about thus far. I want to ask one more poll to the people who are on the webinar. And then Michael, I want to give you a chance to give any last thoughts that you have after you see the poll results. Then I'll provide some last concluding remarks and we'll call it the webinar. Those of you who submitted questions that we didn't get to, if your name is on the question, we will email you a specific answer. If not, we'll try to figure out a way to blast answers to all the questions to as many people as possible. So just to summarize what we talked about thus far, the article is How Leaders Delude Themselves About Disruption. We said 25 years after the phenomena is identified, there's been great work providing a technical challenge. The innovator's dilemma persists. The argument that we make is that leaders lie, and leaders lie to themselves, not because they're bad people, but because it's really hard. And that leads to them discounting the threat and not investing enough in their response. The answer for how you overcome these lies, it starts with the individual transforming themselves by embracing mindfulness and related practices, and transforming their organization by taking a systematic, programmatic effort to really allow people to develop the capacity to be self-transforming leaders that can toggle between different ways of thinking. Now, Michael and I told you that we are both optimists. We want to see whether we have had any impact on all of you. So we're going to open up our second and final poll question, which is, how optimistic are you that we will make progress against these issues in the next 10 years? Let me get the technology to cooperate with me. And I have launched the poll. So how optimistic are you that we will be able to make progress on this in the next 10 years? I think we might have some sample bias in this, Michael, with the people on the webinar, but we will see what people have to say. You get to the end of a webinar, you always will have a fewer who respond than the first one. We've got 4 minutes left until we're at time. We got 40 people quickly, and now it's starting to taper. So I would say we did a reasonable job of making, well, they might have come in this way, but people look pretty optimistic. It's an average score here looks to be about a 4.2 on a 5-point scale. So pretty optimistic about the future. Michael, final comment before I close this down.
No, I think the idea that the next generation of people, the Clay's legacy from the last 25 years since he wrote the first paper on disruptive innovation, the real legacy here that everybody here in this call is part of, and we're trying to develop, is the practice of making our organizations places that can take Clay's ideas forward, that we look at ourselves, we develop ourselves and our own internal biases, we create organizations that are places that are going to support and create a culture that supports disruptive innovation. I think we're at the threshold of being able to do this in a systematic way. So I'm very optimistic.
Great. Well, thank you all for your participation. Let me leave with one final thought. So if you accept what we've talked about here, that if you want to transform an organization, you have to start with transforming yourself. You're stuck in this moment here. I suspect most of you know what is pictured here, but for those of you who don't, this is the moment in the movie The Matrix, where the character Morpheus is giving the character Neo, the main character played by Keanu Reeves, he's giving him a choice. The blue pill, he goes back to his normal life. The red pill, he goes down the rabbit hole and sees how far it goes. And Morpheus is very clear. He says, all I am offering is the truth. This is the moment for all of you who are trying to think about what comes next. It is the moment when you have the choice to take the red pill. Is it easy? No. Going down rabbit holes is hard. Becoming a self-transforming mind is hard. Developing an organization that can do all the things that we talked about here is incredibly hard, but it's doable. And the payoff in terms of building the individual and institutional resilience to respond to disruption, to deflect the threats, to seize the opportunities, in our eyes, makes this an unquestionable choice. You take the red pill and you go and make it happen. Thank you very much for all of you for joining the webinar, for being such great participants, for asking such great questions. Again, the content will be shared with you afterwards. Please share it with colleagues and friends and people you've never met before, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.